Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm Sharon Greenblum. I'm a student at the University of Washington's ENGAGE program, here to welcome you to our event tonight. I'm a student in the genetics department, where I study the trillions of tiny little bugs or bacteria that live in the human body and are affecting your health. If that sounds interesting, I'll be back on this stage Wednesday night at 6 p.m. to give my talk entitled Stories from Your Stomach. I get the opportunity to talk here because of the special collaboration between Town Hall and the UW's ENGAGE program. Together, they host a series called UW's Science Now as part of the Seattle Science Lecture. Sponsors include Microsoft and KPLU. And now to our speaker. Chelsea Kahn is a master's candidate at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the UW. She studies climate change and science communication, looking specifically at newspaper coverage in South Asia. Her research examines the communication of uncertain information about climate change before and after scientific reports have been published. Tonight, she'll tell us about this research in her talk titled Causes, Consequences, and Certainty. Please give a warm welcome to Chelsea.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for being here tonight. As Sharon said, my name is Chelsea Kahn and I'm a student at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington, and I'm also in the ENGAGE program. Tonight I'm really excited to talk to you all about my thesis research in climate change communication, and I look at newspaper coverage in India. And I'm really glad there's such a great turnout tonight because this is a subject I care a lot about, so it's really great that you're all here. So before I get to what I'm going to tell you, I'd like to give you a little background on how I got to what I study today. So, as a kid, I was always really interested in the ocean. That's the blonde one is me. My hair has changed a lot over years. But even as a kid, the ocean enthralled me. I was so enamored by it, and I always wanted to learn about it. So I went to college, and I got a degree in biological oceanography, which is just a fancy way of saying I became a marine biologist. And even after I went to school, I was still absolutely in love with the ocean. So after graduation, I became a coral biologist. And you can see in those pictures there, I was lucky enough to do research in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and at the Little Cayman Island in the Caribbean. And that's where those photos are from. So for those of you who don't know, coral are really tiny little animals, and they're related to jellyfish, and they look like little tiny baby jellyfish. And they grow coral reefs, they build them. And essentially, they take chemicals out of ocean water, and they make hard surfaces that they create these coral reefs, which then create homes for thousands of other animals in these beautiful, beautiful reefs. Now, my job was to study coral growth rates, and because coral actually have to pull the chemicals out of the water, they grow quite slowly to begin with. But what I was quickly learning was that coral were plagued by a lot of things that made them grow even slower than they normally do. Some things like diseases, but the biggest issue is global climate change. Now, this started getting me thinking, coral is being impacted by climate change, but what else is this an issue, and what else are we facing with this issue? So climate change in general is just small changes to the world's environment. We see changes in temperature and rainfall, and it impacts not only our coral reefs, but our environments all around the world. And as we see these changes, the people are being impacted as well. A large amount of the world's population depends on the natural resources of the globe, and as those resources change, their livelihoods and their lives do as well. So then, my next question I asked was, well, climate change is a really big issue, so what do we know about it? Well, luckily, and really excitingly, today, climate scientists around the world agree that climate change is in fact happening, which is a great step forward for us. We also are now agreeing, we're more certain than ever, that climate change is a human-driven process, or an anthropogenic-driven process, which means that while we do see changes to the environment on a regular basis, the impacts humans are driving this process faster, and the changes are coming faster than we are used to. And this is a huge problem for us. But unfortunately, this consensus and this understanding is not seen in the general public. I created a little map for you with some data from 2010 about the general public's understanding of climate change. Now, these are the top 5 emitting countries that contribute to climate change around the world. So they're driving this issue, and they have a huge impact. And the general public from these 5 countries were asked questions like, do you know about climate change? Or do you know something about climate change? Now, in the United States, we had 96% knew what climate change was, and that's really great, and even higher in Japan. But in Russia, we're seeing 83%, and then a drop to China in 65%. And even more scary is in India, only 37% of the population said they knew something about climate change. Now that's really scary, and that got me really interested in India. So I started doing some research on what is going on in India and why this might be an issue, and also why this might be happening. So, India is a country on South Asia. It's home to over 1.2 billion people, which is a lot of people. And as I mentioned, they're one of the top 5 contributors to climate change. So, they have this driving force, so they're a threat to climate change. But they're facing threats from climate change. And what I mean is the populations there are vulnerable to these issues, and they're unable to adapt to the changes. So the changes that these countries are seeing, the changes in temperature and changes in rainfall, about 76% of the country depends on agriculture or a natural resource as a source of livelihood. So when they're seeing these changes from climate change, it's a really big deal there. India is also home to the world's largest mangrove forest. That's the picture on the top side. And mangroves are essentially trees that grow right out of water, and they create an extremely unique ecosystem for animals. And it's also the home of the tiger in India, which is really important and pretty iconic there. India also touches the Himalayan mountain range, and that creates an extreme unique ecosystem for other animals as well, including the rare snow leopard. So we're seeing changes not only in the middle of the country, but on the coasts and in the mountains, and this has huge implications for the unique ecosystems, but also the people who depend on this. And as I mentioned, 1.2 billion people live in India alone, and so these impacts are huge. India is also a developing country, which got me really interested in this, because we've done a lot of research in countries like the United States and Canada and Germany about what people know about climate change, but there's not that much done about India. So I decided to study it because this could maybe be a proxy and help us understand what's going on in other developing countries as we're seeing these changes from climate change. But my next question was, why is it 37%? Why do only 37% of the people in India know something about climate change? So in the face of this issue, what is the challenge? And I began to speculate that it's that climate change is really uncertain. And what I don't mean to say is that climate change, we're not certain if it's happening, because that in fact we are. But all of the science that comes behind this and that helps us figure out what we think is going to happen is really uncertain. So most climate scientists use models to predict or project what they think is going to happen. They try to speculate what we might see in the next few years and how this might change our environment. And those things are uncertain. You can never, have perfect science. Additionally, all scientists can interpret data differently and interpret all of the information differently. And as it gets communicated, sometimes people's personal biases or personal beliefs can get overlaid on this, and that can increase uncertainty as well. So as we communicate, science becomes more uncertain, but it's also just uncertain to begin with. And I think this is one of the biggest barriers facing us today when we communicate about climate change. So then I asked myself, whose job is it to communicate about climate science? Now, essentially, it's everybody's job, but the leader in this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And from here on out, I'll call them the IPCC. But this was a group created by the United Nations in the 1980s to sort of answer this call of what's going on to our planet and what are we going to do? So their job is to take all of the information that scientists around the world know about climate change, and they put it into one place and they condense it. And they publish these assessment reports that put out the information in the most understandable way for anyone to access. They're free online, but they're 1,000-page documents. They publish them in segments, so they do scientific impacts, and then they talk about the implications for humans. And then another report, they'll talk about how to mitigate or how to adapt to these changes. And finally, they do publish one little report that's called the technical summary that takes all of this and condenses it even more. But the general public doesn't necessarily go online and download these reports to get their information. I read them only because I study them, but when you go online and you download the report, this is what you see. Now, this means nothing to me, and I study it on a regular basis. So essentially what it's trying to tell you is change is going to happen, and there's some uncertainty, but it probably doesn't mean anything to you. So how do they take this information and stay true to the science and communicate it in a way that everyone can understand? Now, it's really difficult. So the IPCC created a really regimented system in which they could talk about climate change uncertainty. So I want to show you those words here. On the left-hand side, we have the big words are agreement, evidence, and confidence. And essentially the point of these slides is to show you that it's a really, really regimented system. They use only these few words to talk about uncertainty. And all of the scientists who are involved in writing these reports know this system, and they study this system, and they can only use this system. So when the scientists that everyone in the room is studying a certain change, if they all think, yes, this is true, they'll say, we have high agreement that such and such. Or if someone doesn't think that that is true, they might say, we have medium agreement. And in the same sense, when it comes to evidence, if they have a lot of data to back up their claim or to support their claim, they'll say we have robust evidence. And together, these things make the confidence in their statement. And on the other side, they use a probability scale. They do this by using likelihood qualifiers, so using the phrase likely to explain what they think is going to happen. Now, each of these are sort of stuck with a specific range of percentages that for scientists means a lot. For instance, virtually certain is between 99 and 100%. You can guess that they probably use that phrase really infrequently. But essentially, these are the only words that they'll use. Now, it's unlikely that you are reading the newspaper or reading something about climate change online and you see these phrases and they mean something really specific to you. So my next question for myself was, how does this information get to you and me? So the IPCC does all of this collaboration and condensing of the information, but what are the stages in which it gets from there to you guys and to me and to somebody in India? Who does this process? And as you may have guessed, because the layout of my talk is a newspaper, the answer is newspapers. Now, there are a lot of ways to disseminate information and to share information about climate change. I mean, the internet is a huge player today. But I'm really interested in newspapers. And today in India, they still play a huge role in sharing information about large environmental issues. And climate change is the #1 issue. So I look specifically at them and the language that the journalists use, because people still get their information from there. And journalists are also charged with the task of communicating stuff right and making sure that the people in India know what's going on. So one of the ways I'd like to represent what happens to the information is with an analogy. So I was a teenage girl, obviously, and whenever you go to a sleepover party, you play a lot of games. And one of the games I played a lot as a kid was the game of telephone. And I found an example for you. So the way telephone works is somebody whispers something in someone's ear, and then the next person whispers it to the person next to them, and it goes around in a circle. And the last one says out loud what they heard. And never in a game I've ever played does it come out the same way. It always gets altered, because as someone says something, you either mishear or you feel like changing it or whatever. So here is an example that I found. Someone in your office is on the phone and they say, we're getting the data. And then the person on the phone, of course, mishears them and they say, we're getting what? On what date? And then the nosy guy across the hall hears you say something about someone dating. And now all of a sudden, the story is so not the same. So I took this to mind when I was reading all of the IPCC assessment reports and the newspaper articles. And I read over 100 or 220 newspaper articles in India to see what sort of information is being shared and how they're packaging this. And so I made my own little example of telephone for you. So we have 3 players in this game. We have the IPCC, a journalist, and then maybe a local in India. So one of the lines in the assessment report I found says, there is medium confidence that the increase in the Indian summer monsoon rainfall, ... So you see that phrase, medium confidence, that's one of the ones I showed you earlier. So in a newspaper article that I found, this is what it said. Changes to seasonal monsoon patterns will increase the risk of major floods. Now that's kind of different, right? It's not necessarily saying the same thing, and that sounds like a pretty certain statement. So then somebody reading this in their newspaper in India might think, so it's gonna flood? Should I move? Am I doomed? And you can see the information changes as it gets conveyed in between different parties. And I'm not trying to say that the IPCC isn't doing a good job of communicating uncertainty, and I'm also not saying that journalists aren't doing a good job of taking that information and sharing it with everyone else. Simply that climate change is really hard to communicate about, and the uncertainty makes it really difficult. And as we talk to one another and process this information, it does get changed. So I also wanted to show you a bigger example of what I've been looking at. I created these word clouds for you as I was reading my newspaper articles to show you the difference in ways people communicate about climate change. Now, on the left, these are the same phrases that I showed you earlier, the ones from the IPCC. And the way the word clouds work is the bigger the word, the more frequently it shows up in my search. Now, the same phrases like likely and high agreement and robust evidence are coming to the front. Now, when I read the 220 newspaper articles from India, this is what I found. And I'm hoping that right away you notice there are so many more words on this slide, and they are not the same as the ones in the IPCC assessment report. You know, you see phrases like expected to be or could be, and those are so much less certain and specific than what the IPCC is saying. I did, however, find a few instances where that information did overlap. So I highlighted those words. You can see probability, evidence, certain, confidence, and likely, which is kind of big. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that when the journalists wrote the word likely, they were using it in the same way that the IPCC scientists do. So it's just something to think about when you're reading your newspaper articles. What sort of words are coming up, and are they the same as what you're seeing as the IPCC is saying? So ultimately, they're not doing the same thing, which is sort of the takeaway I would like you to walk away with tonight, is that, you know, we communicate about things in really different ways, and that's a big deal. So what we're seeing today is that the climate is changing now. It's changing right now, and we need to do something about it. And worldwide, not everybody is aware of this issue. In India, 37%. And I don't personally know what's going on in the rest of the world, but you can speculate in many developing countries those numbers are really similar. But it's uncertain and it's difficult to talk about, and we need someone to do it. So the IPCC is doing the best job they can, and they're adapting and manipulating their ways of communicating so that people can better understand this. But that's not necessarily making its way to newspapers in India, which may also show us that that's not happening everywhere around the world as well. But what I'd like you to leave this room with is knowing that, you know, while climate change is really uncertain and we're still trying to figure out what exactly is going on, it's important to continue communicating about it. And as you go forward and you keep talking about climate change, or you read more about climate change, you can maybe be a little bit more critical about the words you're reading or the words that you're conveying, and think about what they might mean to everyone else. And if you're really interested, you can go online and download the IPCC assessment reports and read 1,000 pages about science and learn more about what's going on here, because, you know, we're seeing changes in Seattle. You probably have been stuck in traffic downtown because of the seawall. And, you know, those changes are happening here and now, and they're happening around the world. So we need to continue communicating about it. And hopefully, my research will help us better understand how people are talking about climate change and what this might mean, you know, for the whole world and for the IPCC. And hopefully, my findings will help everyone communicate a little bit better. But I wanted to thank you all so much for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I'd also like to thank the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the College of the Environment. I'd like to thank the Engage program and Seattle Town Hall for this opportunity, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
This is on? Yeah. So thank you very much for your talk. There's a little bit of a subtext that this is sort of a China-India issue. And I just want to make sure everyone understands, I believe the United States is and has been for the past 50 years the top emitter of the top 5, and per person we are by far the top emitter. Is
Yes.
that accurate?
Yes.
So even though we may have 96% awareness, we're the ones making the climate change. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I believe it is, yes.
Thank you. I guess that's a question.
Okay.
It's a statement, obviously.
Thank you.
Hi. So I was looking at your graph, the second and third one, 96% versus 37%.
Yes.
And my question was, did you look at other developing countries and compare their rates? I'm wondering, like, what would Brazil or Nigeria be? Would they be similar?
You know,
Is that based on just poverty numbers versus so the United States is a high rate? I wonder what, like, compared to like Switzerland or England would be as well.
sure. So the question was, did I look at other countries that maybe are on this map that there isn't data representative of, and maybe is the low number related to a developing country? And well, this isn't my data. This I took from a study that was done in 2010, and they only were looking at the top 5 emitting countries. So I don't have that information, and I can't, strongly say that I believe that. But I think, the developing countries, people with access to information can likely influence the percentage of people who understand the issue. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you were aware of the NOAA scientist here in Seattle who condensed every chapter of I believe it was 2013 IPCC report into a very succinct haiku order to make it extremely accessible.
Yeah.
So if you are able to call any of those up, I'd like to know what you think about, first of all, the effectiveness of that, using art forms to communicate about climate science, and also, given that they weren't able to use that many syllables, words like uncertainty and highly likely, we're probably not making it into the haiku. So how do you feel about how well the accuracy of the information was conveyed in those?
Sure. So I don't know any of them off the top of my head. And Meg was talking about, there's a scientist from the IPCC here in Seattle who made the assessment reports into short haikus with pictures. And they were really interesting, and I suggest you check them out. But when you do only have a limited number of words, and this is my general opinion about science communication, is it's impossible to share everything. And as we talk about issues, we need to make it understandable for everyone. You have to use a limited number of words. So I think, depending on the audience you're communicating with, if you're trying to reach an art audience, that's a great way to go. It's especially, it was really catchy and it flooded the internet. So I think that was a wonderful tactic in getting people interested and understanding what's going on. Yeah.
What's his name?
Oh, I don't know what his name is. Do you know? I'm sorry. I can look it up after and let you know.
If you just Google IPCC haiku.
Yeah, if you Google IPCC haiku, it should come up.
So I have a series of questions, but to be gracious to the people behind me, I'll just ask one or two initially, then I'll go back
Sure.
to the line. So the first question has to do with, about the table of contents, as I'm going to be asking about language. I'm going to be asking about sort of directional bias of the journalist and comparing with, say, New York Times writers or Wall Street Journal writers. But the first real question is, here we have this figure 37%. What do we know about the correlation between the 63% and whether they read newspapers or not? So, although it's important and interesting to study this particular issue about newspapers, if none of the 63% read newspapers, then that's kind of a moot point. And then the question becomes, what do people in India who are concerned about this communication, how do they envision getting at the 63%? And having lived and traveled in India at one moment in my life, I can't even imagine many of the 63% even getting close to reading a newspaper. So
certainly.
Make some comments.
So maybe I'll start by saying I have 2 years to write a master's thesis. So, if I could have gone to India and traveled there and understood what's going on, that would have been wonderful. And hopefully I'll get to do that after this. But so he was asking, is this low percentage of people maybe having to do with the number of people who have access to information and to newspapers? And that's certainly a limitation in my study. Is I also only speak English, so I only look at English written newspapers, and that's also a limitation as well. But I think it's pretty important to at least try and get a look at what is going on there, so that it could show us maybe what's going on in other countries. And I am aware that not everybody has access to newspapers and not everybody speaks English. So certainly that does change what I'm finding. But if I could learn more languages and read more newspapers, I certainly would.
So I'll go back to my
Okay.
The whole global climate change thing is really hard to wrap your head around when you think of the entire globe.
Mhm.
Everybody's affected, and all these things are going to happen to everyone. And I'm wondering how much communication is happening on the local level, where you could say, oh, Seattle, okay, well, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, then it's going to be up to the Hospital Hill, the water is, or whatever, you know. Is there communication going by a region or by smaller bits and pieces saying, this is how your area would most likely be affected? You're going to have drought, or you probably have floods, or, you know, hot temperatures, cold, whatever. How much of that is going on?
Sure. So I don't.
More relational.
Yeah, I don't do any research here, but our question is about how much information is shared sort of on a local or a regional level, and are there efforts about that? And I know in Seattle, people are pretty aware of what's going on. It's, I don't have any data points about that, but I think generally, as a city, we're aware of climate change. But some of my research I'm actually doing in India is looking at what issues the newspaper articles are also talking about. So one thing I didn't mention is that India depends on a monsoon, which is sort of rains that come on a seasonal cycle, and as an agriculture country, they depend on this a lot. And the three major issues that they're talking about are all based in India. It's changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, and changes in the time of the monsoon. And when I was coding for those data points, I was also looking at where they were talking about issues. And most of the newspaper articles I read in India were about changes in India and sort of regional issues as well. But I think in Seattle, we do a pretty good job. I mean, ocean acidification, which is the change of the chemical composition of the ocean, is a big issue here, and we've been having those big pieces in the Seattle Times about OA, which is, I think, really great. So I think that there are efforts happening, yes.
No, actually, I can respond because Dr. Amy Snowberg at the UW was the lead convening author on U.S. Climate Assessment, 3rd Annual Report, and that is available online, and she looked at this region. So understanding snowfall and rainfall, et cetera. So that is what was global.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kahn, for a very informative and well-communicated presentation.
Thank you.
I have two brief questions. The first is, in the U.S. media climate, it's almost virtually certain that there's purposeful distortion on climate information, which is a point of despair. But then there's also the promise that, you know, in the world of social media, we are the media. What?
Negative from our point of view. But I'm curious, even in the New York Times, they try to do a really balanced thing where they try to quote somebody who they tried to reach to get the other side of the story. And I'm curious about how much the Indian journalists who are writing in English newspapers are trying to emulate what is being done elsewhere, or are paralleling these kind of styles, or is it a uniquely Indian thing? And you partly answered that by saying that they draw largely on their own data from India and Indian scientists. And you're not seeing that much quoting from external, like international levels?
There is some, and they do cite the IPCC a lot as well. So they're pulling from a lot of different sources, but a large portion of the articles, they'll cite multiple sources as well, as we see in a lot of newspaper articles. But often there's a political or scientific interest from India, and they're always saying climate change is happening. And if they have any uncertainty in their newspaper articles, it's whether or not certain events are going to happen or how much they're going to change.
What are you finding between the reporting section of the newspapers and the editorial sections of the newspapers?
So, and that question was about, am I seeing different things in editorial and op-eds than I am in the reporting side? And I actually excluded editorials from my research because they do portray a different opinion sometimes, and that could sort of skew my research. And I just wanted to look at what they're getting from reporting side only.
See, in our household, my wife goes right to the editorial page, and I do the opposite. I look at the reporting side, and so I think you might want to look at that.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about how the communication about climate change could be improved.
That's a great question. So she asked what I think could be done to improve climate change communication. Well, so I think the first step in doing that is communicating about it more. I mean, you're probably all here because you know something about climate change or you're interested to learn more. But you know, that doesn't go for everyone in the United States, and it doesn't go for everyone in the world. So I think we're doing a lot of research on what's going to happen, but I don't believe that gets shared often enough. So the more we can talk about it, I think the better the information sharing will be. But I also think now that we are certain that climate change is happening and we're 95% certain that it's a human-driven process, you know, we should talk certainly about this issue and sort of stop maybe portraying both sides and sort of communicate about as a real thing. We are facing these changes today. But I think it's also really important as a scientist to understand what your audience is going to be able to understand, and rather than throwing out phrases that maybe someone doesn't get or doesn't mean anything to, we should use words and phrases that people will be able to understand and interpret in the same way that you're trying to convey to them. So sort of simplifying the message that you're trying to get across, but by always being able to provide more information and data to back that up. So. Okay. One more quick question.
97 was mentioned a couple of times. I'd like to call your attention about the power of humor in all of this. And I don't know how many of you have seen the YouTube with John Oliver and Bill Nye. Just put their two names in and you'll get it. It came out on the new show. There's a little few words that won't come across, get bleeped out on the Daily Show that's not bleeped out there. Anyway, talking about the 97%. So he was having a debate between Bill Nye and supposedly the other side. And this is the one thing in the media, especially sort of the Fox type media, where the fairness doctrine still holds, regardless of the scientists who actually study it. Believe not, in the last few years, it's 97.1% of publications and authors say not only is climate change, global change, primarily warming, but some places cooling, but climate change is real and it is human in origin fundamentally. It's not just that it's happening, but we're the cause. And so it's a no-brainer in the science community. It's like we're back arguing evolution or something. It's about what it is, except in evolution there weren't that many capitalist, money-oriented interests that had a vested interest fighting against it. Mainly here we're talking about fossil fuel industry. But they're kind of keeping their mouth quiet now, some of the big oil companies, not the Koch brothers and so on. But I urge you, just take a look at this. It does a wonderful, wonderful job. John Oliver does a really nice job characterizing the so-called debate about global warming, because there's not a debate about it happening and it's human in the scientific community. It's overwhelming.
Right.
That's where you get the 97%.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll be around if you have any more questions.